Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Chapter 12, Night Watch. In this chapter, Dillard goes camping in what she calls the Locust Meadow, a field full of grasshoppers near an abandoned cottage. And throughout this chapter, she's going to hint at her central tension, the beauty versus the cruelty of the earth. And she's going to do this with imagery of Eden. This place feels in some ways Edenic. She opens the chapter by walking through a field of grasshoppers who spring up everywhere. She's unable to see them until she walks through them, and she only notices them as soon as they spring. When they land, she can no longer see them, much like in the stalking chapter. On page 210, she says, "I was in shelter, but open to the sky. The meadow was clean, the world new, and I washed by my walk over the waters of the dam. A new wild feeling descended upon me and caught me up. What if these grasshoppers were locusts, I thought. What if I were the first man in the world and stood in a swarm?" Notice her approach to both Edenic imagery, the idea of the newness of the world, and the newness of herself having been washed. The idea of being the only person alive, the very first person, but also linking to the fall within the Eden story. There's a continuous tension between rising and falling throughout this chapter. Even there, the new wild feeling descends and catches her up. A down and an up. As soon as one notices the tension between falling and rising, one can't help see it on every page. The very first paragraph, she talks about the rising heat, the falling night. She speaks, of course, of the rise and fall of the grasshoppers, the rise and fall of the blades of grass that the grasshoppers land upon, as the grasshopper lands upon the grass and rides it down. As she crosses the dam into the meadow, she reflects upon the possibility of falling and being borne away on the water. Later, she watches the fall of thistledown and the fall of starlight. And although she connects all this imagery of falling to the fall of man in the story of Eden, all of it takes a kind of lightness. And so as she moves through this chapter, she unpacks this feeling. Both the feeling of newness that she feels in the Edenic quality of the meadow, and the idea of fallenness that she represents in the locusts. On pages 210 and 211, she explains the existence of locusts. For years, people could not figure out where locusts were coming from, until finally one Russian naturalist discovered that locusts were actually grasshoppers. When these grasshoppers are forced into certain conditions, they transform physically, and their behavior changes into a kind of plague. She says, "If you take ordinary grasshoppers of any of several species from any of a number of the world's dry regions, including the Rocky Mountains, and rear them in glass jars under crowded conditions, they go into the migratory phase. That is, they turn into locusts. They literally and physically change from Jekyll to Hyde before your eyes. They will even change all alone in their jars if you stimulate them by a rapid succession of artificial touches. Imperceptibly at first, their wings and wing covers elongate. Their drab color heightens, then saturates more and more, until it locks at the hysterical locust yellows and pinks. Stripes and dots appear on the wing covers, those deepen to glittering black. They lay more egg pods than grasshoppers. They are restless, excitable, voracious. You now have jars full of plague." She also says, "The world has locusts and the world has grasshoppers. I was up to my knees in the world." We see her connection back to many of the images previous in the book. On page 212, a grasshopper lands on her shoulder, reminding us of the grasshopper that she humanized in the chapter The Fixed. On page 212, she also says, "A new wind was stirring. I had received the grasshoppers the way I received this wind. All around the meadow's rim, the highest trees heaved soundlessly." We're reminded of the wind imagery we've seen earlier in the book, in the winter chapter. The wind in the winter chapter was an engendering wind, a wind that brought life. In this case, it's another wind that she embraces, although she's not quite sure what this wind is going to bring. Is it bringing grasshoppers, or is it bringing locusts? Is it bringing Eden, or is it bringing the fall? At this point, she introduces another idea related to rising and falling, the idea of lightness. She watches a muskrat eat off some grass, but as she approaches the tuft of grass, she can see no damage. She says, "Does everything else but me pass so lightly?" When she arrives in the Locust Meadow, on page 215, she says, This is what I had come for, just this and nothing more. A fling of leafy motion on the cliffs, the assault of real things, living and still, with shapes and powers under the sky. This is my city, my culture, and all the world I need. Notice the way she continues to reinforce the passive receipt of everything around her. She walks around the meadow and looks at the cottage, mentioning that the cottage proper seemed an afterthought, as Adam seems sometimes an afterthought in Eden. She walks into the cottage, which is empty, the windows are broken out, and outside she sees a goldfinch, which lands on a purple thistle and begins to empty the seed case. And watching the goldfinch strew the down from the thistle into the air feels like the culmination of this chapter. She says, "Is this where we live, I thought, in this place, at this moment, with the air so light and wild? The same fixity that collapses stars and drives the mantis to devour her mate eased these creatures together before my eyes. The thick, adept bill of the goldfinch, and the feathery, coated down. How could anything be amiss? If I myself were lighter and frayed, I could ride these small winds too, taking my chances, for the pleasure of being so purely played." Notice the unity between the dark images she's already introduced and this light, beautiful image. She then connects the thistles back to the Eden story, in the fact that thistles are part of Adam's curse. But this thistle in particular seems to be bringing her joy rather than pain and sorrow. If this furling air is fallen, then the fall was happy indeed, she says. She goes on to describe her evening as she lay on the ground in her sleeping bag, and the sounds fell all about her. And as she listens to the night sounds and the night risings and fallings, she says, she begins to think about tides, the tides pulled by the moon. And she goes on to describe an image in Edwin Way Teale of eels crawling across the earth in migration. These same tide images are images she's going to use again in the chapter Northing. The idea of the ground crawling with eels awakens her to wonder, as so often happens in this book. She is coming to her conclusion. On page 223 and 224, she begins to unpack all of this rising and falling imagery. She starts after a break with saying, "Had this place always been so, and I had not known it? There were blowings and flights, tossings and heaves up in the air and down to the grass. Why didn't God let the animals in Eden name the man? Why didn't I wrestle the grasshopper on my shoulder and pin him down until he called my name? I was thistledown, and now I seem to be grass, the receiver of grasshoppers and eels and mantises, grass, the wind-blown and final receiver." In this moment she begins to wonder who she is, and she recognizes herself in link with the grass, the one who receives. She describes watching a juggler, whose hands seem almost motionless. The balls seem to be of their own volition, she says. Each falling ball seems to trail beauty as its after-image, receding faintly down the air, almost disappearing, when lo, another real ball falls, shedding its transparent beauty, and another. A moment later she says, "I am puffed clay, blown up and set down. That I fall like Adam is not surprising. I plunge, waft, arc, pour, and dive. The surprise is how good the wind feels on my face as I fall. And the other surprise is that I ever rise at all. I rise when I receive like grass." And so, recognizing herself as the receiver, in her final image of the chapter, she imagines herself again in the meadow, not receiving the grasshoppers that bounce all around her, but receiving the locusts. She says, "I cannot ask for more than to be so wholly acted upon, flown at, and lighted on in throngs, probed, knocked, even bitten. A little blood from the wrists and throat is the price I would willingly pay for that pleasure of cracking weights on my shoulders, for the scent of deserts, ground fire in my ears, for being so in the clustering thick of things, wrapped and enwrapped in the rising and falling real world." And so in her journey here, she's learning to deal with the changed perspective on the world and its flaws, still stalking it, catching what falls, falling herself, and embracing all of it anyway. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.